Hello, everyone. This is Tom Fox, and I'd like to welcome you to episode 89 of Compliance Into the Weeds, a podcast where, with Mr. Radical Compliance, Matt Kelly, we take a deep dive, literally going into the weeds for a compliance or compliance-related topic each week. Today, we unpack, or continue to unpack, the situation at Michigan State, where the interim president, John Engler, made some comments as to what he hoped a compliance program and chief compliance officer would bring to the university. Matt wrote about this in a blog post entitled, Another Compliance Lesson for Michigan State. And in it, we explore what goes into a compliance program. Is it simply the policies and procedures, the technical components of a written program? Or is it a tone? Is it a culture? Is it values? We conclude that it's really both, and that's something John Engler needs to learn about compliance at Michigan State. We also use it as a jumping off point to discuss other culture, trust, and value issues from top management currently in the news. This is Tom Fox. I'm the Compliance Evangelist. Compliance Into the Weeds is a part of the Compliance Podcast Network. Hello, everyone. This is Tom Fox, and you are in for a real treat today because I have with me in Houston, Texas, live, Mr. Radical Compliance himself, Matt Kelly. We are here for a live recording, another live recording. We did one in Cambridge a couple of weeks ago, and now we're doing one in Houston at the Westin Oaks of Compliance Into the Weeds. Matt, welcome to Houston, and thank you for bringing us some warm weather.
Hello, Tom. It's good to be here, although the humidity is all Texas and all Houston.
All the time.
Yeah.
All the time. So, Matt, I really wanted to unpack with you a blog post you wrote last week about the continuing travails of Michigan State compliance and their problems around Larry Nassar. You want to set the stage for us?
Yeah, sure. So I think as many people probably already know, Larry Nassar was the instigator and the culprit of the crisis here at Michigan State. He was the team doctor who for decades was abusing young girls. He was with the USA Gymnastics team. He was affiliated with the University of Michigan or Michigan State as a doctor of homeopathic medicine or something to that effect. But he was abusing girls while working under the auspices of Michigan State for the better part of 20 years. Among them are some of the Olympic gymnasts that we saw in 2016. It's a very well-known case. He is now serving, I think, probably the rest of his life in prison. However, this led to some very painful discussions within Michigan State about how did this happen, how did allegations against him go ignored for so long, how did investigations go nowhere, how are they going to reform the institution. If I remember correctly, the athletic director, the dean, one of the deans, perhaps dean of the medical school, and the university president all were basically forced out. And now the university, under acting president John Engler, who is the former governor of Michigan, they are still trying to reconstitute good relations with the community, but that's going to be a tough job considering how badly Michigan State handled itself.
So I would say the one positive thing I've seen out of this is that Michigan State stepped up, not immediately, but probably as quickly as one could under these circumstances to create a blanket or a settlement pool of money of $500 million to settle with all claimants. And I don't know how that's going to be administered, but coming up with that amount, agreeing to that amount was certainly, I thought, a positive statement. But we are here today actually to talk about some of the compliance program implications because there was some pretty interesting stuff that you read about and ended up writing about. You want to lay that out for us?
Yeah, so earlier this, probably in June, I guess, Governor Engler, acting MSU President Engler, he said he was going to create a new Office of Ethics, Risk Management, and Compliance. And that would be a new position within MSU, and it would be staffed by some full-time professional. They currently have an interim person there who was hired last week, who's a law professor at Michigan State. But what caught my eye was a columnist at the Detroit Free Press. Her name is Rochelle Riley. She wrote a really blistering column about how the purpose of creating this, because Governor Engler had basically given an interview saying that the purpose of this office is to catch red flags so these things don't happen. And so the Free Press columnist, Rochelle Riley, she shot back that, I have it right here, flags don't catch people. People catch people. And had people listened to people, dozens of girls might have been spared what the first ones endured. It was a very searing sort of primal scream against Governor Engler and the rather dry way he was describing what this office is doing. And we should add that there's a lot of antipathy and resentment toward Governor Engler already, even though he's only been in the interim role there for several months, because back in April, he expressed some skepticism at one of the abuse victims, basically saying that she was a front and getting kickbacks from the litigators suing Michigan State. Now, that is not true, and Engler apologized, but it was a tremendously offensive and impolitic thing to say, and a lot of people already wanted him out because of that. And here he is now giving this very boring, kind of straightforward description of a chief compliance officer. And the Free Press columnist was, I think, speaking for the Michigan community, saying that this is really a much deeper, more raw issue than that.
The thing that really struck me about your blog post, in addition to laying out or reciting the facts, as you've done here, though, is you really pointed out that a compliance program, an overall compliance strategy, has both.
Yeah.
It does have policies and procedures. It does have people who review documents. It does have people who investigate red flags. But it's much broader than that. It's an ethos. It's an entire culture. It's much more than a strategy. It's your very DNA that if someone speaks up, that person is listened to, and if appropriate, an investigation is begun and it's resolved. And that's what I'm not sure Engler appreciates that, but once you lay out kind of how you see that all working together, I thought that was a very powerful statement.
As I was reading Rochelle Riley's column, and where she said, flags don't catch people, people catch people, well, it kind of struck me that both she and Engler, they are both right and both talking past each other at the same time. That he is really framing this issue in terms of procedures and probably even something as boring as data analytics, and it's all very crucial that a compliance program have that. But Riley was really much more trying to get at issues around tone at the top, around escalation, so that when somebody says something, they feel like they have been heard, which did not happen at Michigan State previous to this. So both are right. Certainly, a good compliance function is never going to succeed without clear policies and procedures, but it's not going to succeed without the sort of cultural appreciation about what has to happen and the need to have the stakeholders feel like this is a serious effort, that they are going to be heard. And if I had to say one is more important than the other, I think Riley kind of put her finger on the one that is more important. I described it as a kind of a primal scream of rage that the Michigan State community must be so frustrated at having to have this problem for so long. And they're entirely right to be frustrated. That primal scream has to be heard. And I don't know that Engler has done enough of a good job about that. He seems to be a bit tone deaf as to the raw emotion that's still there.
I really got the sense that he viewed this similar to, was it Ken Feinberg that administered both the 9/11 and
yes.
Deepwater Horizon funds and the GM fund, that he almost viewed it as that sort of problem. Well, we're going to pay some money and we'll administer it, and that'll be the end of it. And probably the most time-worn phrase, or one of the most time-worn phrases I know of in compliance, is tone at the top. There's a reason that in every formulation, something along those lines is number one.
Yeah.
Because if you don't have the right tone, if that tone at the top doesn't set the culture, it doesn't matter how many people you have reviewing red flags. It's not going to change.
I think so, and it's interesting that you brought up Ken Feinberg, who I am generally a fan of his work because he is so respectful of victims' pain. He also distributed the funds for the Boston Marathon bombing victims, and Feinberg was the sort of person who came in after the tone was set by some other tops. In Massachusetts, Governor Deval Patrick did a very good job setting the tone at the top after the bombing. I would even say that President George W. Bush did a very good job setting the tone at the top after the September 11th attacks, whatever other issues you might have with him. And then Feinberg was the details man who came in, and he was very good at that. Engler seems to be doing this a bit backwards, that he is focusing on building the systems, and I think that maybe Michigan State still isn't quite over the passionate part that has to be discussed and aired yet. The systems are still going to matter, but it seems to me that there's a lot of people who think they're putting the cart before the horse there. And certainly he did himself no favors with that email earlier in the spring where he smeared one of the abuse victims, and that just kind of poisoned the atmosphere for a lot of people, that it's very difficult to recover from that sort of mistone, if that's a legitimate word to use here. And after that, it's just you come across as the guy putting in the systems. And I don't think Rochelle Riley would say the systems are going to be unimportant. I think she would just say there's still so much that has to be listened to here.
So many universities are facing some pretty serious challenges, and we've had another one come up that you wrote about this week at Ohio State.
Yeah.
But there the issue seems to be a little bit different. And it really turned on, well, at least part of your post turned on the language in the policies and procedures of existing policies and procedures of Ohio State regarding reporting, regarding reporting assaults, reporting misconduct, and or perhaps even boy talk, banter in the locker room.
Yeah. So this involved a congressman from Ohio. His name is Jim Jordan. He's been in Congress since 2007, and he is an outspoken leader of the Tea Party movement among the Republican Party, and he is very much a leader in investigating supposed conspiracies in the Justice Department to bring down Donald Trump, which I think is just cockamamie. However, that is who he is, and he was the assistant wrestling coach at Ohio State back in the 80s and 90s when a doctor at Ohio State was sexually abusing boys on the wrestling team. And that doctor, whose name escapes me, he did eventually commit suicide in the mid-2000s. Recent news reports have had several former students on the wrestling team at that time say that this was going on, and Congressman Jordan knew about it. Several of them said that we took these issues to Congressman Jordan when he was then just an assistant coach, and he laughed them off. He didn't take them seriously. And it's, again, of a piece. There's always some big prime offender, and then there is somebody else who is either enabling or enabling through inaction. Somebody described Jim Jordan now, he's going to be Ohio State's Joe Paterno, based on the abuse scandal over at Penn State that happened several years ago. I don't know all of that. This does not look good for Jim Jordan because more and more people are coming out. More and more people are coming out and saying that we told him directly. He has somewhat changed his story from the first allegations where he said this is not true to, well, whatever might have got said in the locker room, I can't take that as an allegation. Actually, yes, you can if you're in a leadership position, and he was. There's no such thing as a locker room exemption or locker room privilege. If there's an allegation that's made and you hear about it, we talk today so often about if you hear some sort of sexual harassment in the workplace, you don't have to be the victim to report it. If you see two other parties and you're the third party seeing it, you can report it. He would have been, and he didn't. Was it a different era? Maybe you could make that argument a bit. That's a bit of a stretch. Might he not have known what to do? I would even give Jordan a little bit of credit for that if he had said something like, when I started work, I was 23. I didn't really know what I was supposed to do with that. This is a very serious allegation. I wasn't quite sure how to handle that. That's fair for a 23-year-old to say that. I would give them some leeway, even though I'm not condoning it, but I can see where a 23-year-old would say it. Now, he did stay on the job for 10 years or so, and it's very different when you're a 30-year-old who's been experienced and there for 8 years and you still see it. I'm hard-pressed to believe you don't know how to handle it then. But the way that he's trying to flim-flam, that was it an allegation or was it locker room talk? Like that's when that strikes me as a losing argument to make, or you're on the backside of the hill when you should be at the top of it.
So to me, one of the key things that came out of the Me Too movement was something that you highlighted, which is it is not only the responsibility or the right of the person who's abused to come forward, but it's the responsibility of those who see it, that those who observe it, that those who know about it to come forward as well. Are you seeing that kind of discussion continue in the compliance community?
I am, and I think it's 1 foot in ethics and compliance and 1 foot in the HR community in a broader sense. Who cares so long as that conversation is happening, because it's a good conversation and a good stance to adopt. I do think that we're going to go through a period of these somewhat awkward scenarios, like with Congressman Jim Jordan. What were the cultural standards at Ohio State 20 years ago? We don't necessarily know. We do know that there was a sexual harassment policy. It was in place before he showed up. Did he have to sign it? Was he trained on it? Did anybody explain it to him? Was it something where they said, that if you see sexual misconduct, you had to report it? That's the current policy at Ohio State, but it might have been something different in 1990 and when he was 24, 25. Did they train him the right way to see it the right way? We don't know right now, but these things, these past indiscretions and transgressions come back to haunt people, and it's not invalid for people to say we weren't really quite sure what to do. It's a bit of a stretch depending on some circumstances, and I'd put Jordan in that camp. But, there will be circumstances where somebody might say, look, I was 22, I worked there for 6 months when I was 20 years ago, and I wasn't quite sure what to do. I'm willing to hear that argument out, and I think most reasonable people would. In Jim Jordan's case, I don't see that his argument fits that kind of scenario that I'm sketching out. But I suspect this is not the last time we're going to go through this, either in higher ed or in the corporate world.
So you brought up another point I wanted to follow up on, which is training. Certainly there is training that says don't harass. And there's certainly training that says if you are harassed, here's where you can go. But specifically on this training for those who may observe, or those who may think, or those who may know about abusers or harassers in the office, do you see compliance as really using that to talk about if you are aware of compliance violations? If you suspect, move forward, raise your hand, say something. Is that part of the training that may now come to the fore?
I mean, in many ways it already is, because what we're talking about is mandatory reporting if you see something. And in many other types of misconduct, companies embrace that full on. If you are a product manufacturer and an employee sees that there's a product defect that might impose customer harm, like, company's going to say, you have to report that. You can't sit on it. And I think that I would put this now in that realm. But this is, I think, still going to be fairly new for a lot of organizations, more than it should, but we still are where we are. Even if we know how we want to get out of it, we're still in the throes of getting out of this at many organizations. And so I think that it is going to be a challenge. I haven't taken a poll on exactly what people are training employees on. I will say that when you look at companies that get listed on the best places to work for women or that have large female populations, generally they do take harassment very seriously, and they do tell people if you even see it, not experience it, if you see it, you can report it, and they take it seriously. And that is a standard I think we should all move to, but I think we're still in the moving to period.
So it also spoke to me of another issue on training, which is everybody has to be trained. Contract people have to be trained.
Yeah.
Temporary employees, those who are less than full-time, everybody needs that type of training going forward.
I think that they do. And there was a great article in the Wall Street Journal not long ago about what if the harasser is a company client. How are you supposed to handle that? And raising that issue can pose some severe career jeopardy to some women, I'm sure. And so how would they finesse that? It was a very delicate matter, and the article was well worth reading. But we are all going to be somebody else's third party, and we all worry about third party risks. This is just another risk. that third parties can do. You might as well get trained on it because inevitably, there's no downside, I'll put it that way. There is no harm in training people that if you see some misconduct, you should speak up about it, regardless of your relation to the offender or the victim.
Well, given the number of high-profile CEOs that have been brought down by this recently, and I think it was the CEO of Intel who recently left for having a consensual relationship with an employee, I think there's a highly sensitized recognition of risk and reputational damage here that was not present before.
Yeah, and I thought about the Intel incident because it was consensual, and it doesn't look like it led to any severe harm to the company. Intel is still doing very well. However, if you allow a senior executive to, number one, violate policy, because that was the policy was, and he violated it, so you can't make an exception for that. It sets a terrible precedent. But if we allow these things, even if they're consensual, how much does that open the door to people then trying to flirt with employees, and then suddenly it goes from flirtation to unwanted contact and harassment? Like, it's a slippery slope. So for senior executives dating subordinates, that's why we don't have this. And unfortunately for CEOs, everyone else is subordinate to you. So you can't do it. He did it. The board had no choice except to stick with its policy. So I credit Intel for making a decision that I'm sure nobody wanted to make, but it was the right thing to do anyways.
Do you see that as because of the power dynamic, or is it perhaps a judgment call that a CEO made that could portend a company get into risky situations in the future?
I think it's both, to be honest. And we should add, this is not the first time we've seen this. The first time I remember seeing it was actually with Boeing about 12 or 13 years ago. They had a CEO, Henry Stonecipher, who I remember because that's an awesome name. But he had a very consensual relationship with a subordinate, and it was in violation of company policy. And he stood up and said, look, it's my policy. I wrote it, then I broke it, so I have to resign. And he quit. Or I think the board invited him to leave, or however we want to pave it over. But nonetheless, he understood that there was a policy violation, and he could not allow that to take place, even though he was going to be the one who had to fall on the sword.
So, Matt, as we move to near the end of this podcast, I find it fascinating that we have gone down the trail of policies and training, where we started with a topic really about culture and policies. Mm-hmm. And I think it's, to me, emphasized how important policies are, but also you have emphasized how important having that culture is as well.
It absolutely is. And it's difficult because, how do you effectuate these cultures? That's hard. What are the values it's easy to say what the values are, but how do you bring them about? That can be difficult. And it's everybody knows it when they see it, except it's very hard to put into words and even harder to put into actions. But it's always going to be the thing that people remember. People will remember Michigan State doesn't take sexual harassment seriously. That's why I don't like it and all this stuff. It will be a long time before anybody says, Michigan State has a great incident reporting system. I don't think most stakeholders are ever going to think about that with Michigan State. They're only going to know, do I get taken seriously? Do I get hurt or not?
Well, I was going to say something as trite as we have to stop meeting like this, but I have to say these live podcasts are just a ton of fun.
They are indeed.
Hope we can do more.
All right.
Thanks. Hello, everyone. This is Tom Fox again. I'd like to thank you for listening to this episode of Compliance Into the Weeds. If you'd like some more information on the topic today, you can reach Matt at mkelly@radicalcompliance.com. You can reach me, Tom Fox, at tfox@tfoxlaw.com. If you've never rated our podcast and you listen to this on iTunes, I would greatly appreciate it if you would rate our podcast. Also, we're developing a mailbag episode, so if you have any questions for the guys at Radical Compliance, please shoot us an email. I hope you've enjoyed this episode, and thanks again for listening. I hope you'll join us again next week, where Matt Kelly and I take a deep dive, literally going into the weeds, in another episode of Compliance Into the Weeds, a part of the Compliance Podcast Network.